Welcome to the next episode of Sage and Sanity, where we do a whole lot of cleansing and bringing ourselves back to a semblance of sanity in our lives. I'm so glad to be back. I am going to be talking today about a topic that's really meaningful to me. Last week, I talked about my educational upbringing and how it tied to my fundamentalist Christianity and the trauma associated with that. And this week, I would like to talk about purity culture. So, this podcast is entitled Grab Your Chastity Belt. So, let's just kind of dive into it. So, I want to start off with a little bit of background of my experience growing up in purity culture and what was pushed on us. So, when I was younger, growing up in a homeschool family, as I mentioned before, I never had a talk about the birds and the bees with my parents. I actually figured out how babies were made from watching a horse nature program, which sounds absolutely ridiculous. I legitimately thought you kissed to make babies till I was 15 years old. I knew that there was a difference between boys and girls because I had been babysitting from a young age, but I didn't understand why. And nobody ever told me why there was a difference between boys and girls and how babies were made. So I remember hearing a story about, as a kid, going to school and saying that my dad got me pregnant, and it was because I thought that kissing made you pregnant. So I think that a big reason that was not talked about in my family is just the heavy shame that surrounded around the topic of sexuality in the church, and also from my own parents' trauma around the topic. And I'm sure as a parent that's really hard to breach that subject with your kid. So I'm not uncompassionate about that, but I really wish that I had had some sort of education about it and in a non-shaming way. So I had mentioned that I learned how babies are made from watching a horse nature program when I was 15. So I was watching a show on Channel 11 about wild horses in Colorado. And it was all fine and dandy. I loved horses growing up, so I was super excited about this show. And all of a sudden, the stud started mounting the mare. And at that time, my mom had come into the room and she was like, "What are you watching?" And I said, "I don't know." And she was like, "Turn it off." And I was like, "Okay." But I didn't really understand why, and the cogs in my brain started working a little bit at this point, and I was like, that boy horse kind of looks like, I wonder. But my suspicions were completely confirmed when I was babysitting for a family, and they had these cookie cutter people, and one was Adam and it had a peg, and one was Eve and it had a hole, and they stuck together. And I remember being completely horrified. I thought it was the most disgusting thing I've ever heard in my life, and I wanted nothing to do with it. And I had a lot of confusion and shame and just disgust around that topic for most of my life. And I remember being in my young 20s and moving out to Washington for college, and I had started doing West Coast swing dancing, which I really love to do, and I was hanging out with a bunch of my dance friends. And they thought it would be really, really cute to introduce South Park to the Bible college student. And they had me watch the Horathon episode. And I don't stutter, it was the Horathon episode. And there was whole sorts of things that were going on that I was very confused about. And then the guy started joking about a labia, and I literally did not know what they were talking about. I had no idea what the parts of my body were. In our family, we never talked about that. We called vaginas hoo-has and penises wing-wangs, and there was just like a lot of secrecy and shame about our bodies in that regard. And it wasn't encouraged in the church to talk about those things. It was just very hush-hush, something that you would deal with once you were married. And I remember there was a really big push in our family, along with the purity culture movement, to wait for sex till marriage. And True Love Waits was just like everywhere. And I read so many purity books. And my dad, when I was 16, bought me a gold wedding band and laser etched True Love Waits on it. And we were supposed to keep that on until we got married, and then we were going to give it to our husband on our wedding day, and all this stuff like that. And I definitely was very afraid of intimacy and had no idea what was a healthy view of any of that. And I feel like a lot of that came from just the purity culture bullshit that was shoved down our throats growing up in the church. And it was always like women need to be chaste, but boys will be boys. And you don't want to like tarnish yourself or lose pieces of yourself or whatever. You need to keep yourself pure for your husband. And it was always like when you were growing up in your home, your body was owned by your dad, and then when you got married, your body was owned by your husband. So there was honestly no autonomy, and it really devastated me, my life, my idea of sex and sexuality, and a lot of people I know in the church, especially of my age, where the I Kiss Dating Goodbye book was constantly being read, and The Bride Wore White, all of those. And when I started critical thinking about this topic, I actually threw those books out because I didn't even want to give them to anybody. Um, but yeah, I just had really wished that somebody had talked to me in a constructive, non shaming way about my body, about my urges, about just the topic of sexuality. And I definitely have a huge passion about this topic and making sure that I will educate my daughter someday and that her body is not to be shamed and that there's definitely boundaries around it, but it's not something to be scared of, ashamed of. I want her to know her body, know the parts of her body. Um, and I definitely will not be pushing purity culture on my daughter. Um, I know so many people who just really fed into that. So anytime we would mess up or do anything that was considered unholy in that way, we felt like we were tarnished, like we were not good anymore. I heard stories even of people being accused of doing inappropriate things just from using tampons. Um, there's just a deeply rooted hatred and confusion around the woman's body, around her sexual needs and desires, and I just think it's really quite sad and disgusting. And I definitely want to do everything I can in my power to fight that kind of thinking because there's nothing wrong with my sexuality, my body. There's nothing to be shamed about my body parts or me having needs or desires. And that's kind of just what I really want to be an advocate for is just loving who you are, loving your body, being educated in that way. So I actually kind of want to write a book about this topic, and I will talk more about it in coming podcasts, but I just wanted to start with this, and I thank you so much for listening. Love and light.